This is Bab Adatiba here with Minds Alike. I'm sitting down, have the privilege and honor to sit down with Mavis B Knight, Democrat elected to the State Board of Education in 2002, re-elected in '04 and '08 for her excellent performance. She currently serves on the board committees of school initiatives. She has plenty experience in helping the Texas state, plenty experience in helping the Dallas community. Just years and years of honor and awards and positions. So I'm going to give her a chance to introduce herself for a second.
Well, I'm Mavis B Knight, and I serve on the Texas State Board of Education, and I represent Dallas and Tarrant counties. I have the southern portion of Dallas County and the eastern portion of Tarrant County.
Excellent. Recently, well, not recently, but pretty recently, we went through some textbook changes, history textbooks. And for anyone that doesn't know, Texas is a major supplier of textbooks. So whatever changes we make every 10 years to our curriculum stretches across the nation. Um, Once you were reelected and you saw the new makeup of the board, did you foreshadow any headbutting of any kind with changing the curriculum?
Once I became acquainted with my fellow board members, I noticed that we were outnumbered by the social conservatives on the board. They had a 7-person voting block, and it was very easy for them to get that eighth vote that would make them have the majority in decisions that were made by the board. Originally, I had thought that I would be discussing and dialoguing with open minded individuals who would be receptive to bridging differences in opinions in order to come out with the best possible solutions and standards for the students and the teachers and the parents and the school systems in Texas. But that illusion, it lasted for about 2 seconds.
Okay, so reality hit you in the face. One of the first things I want to touch on was the semantics, I guess. A lot of changes. The biggest changes for me was switching the term slavery to Atlantic Triangular trade and free market versus capitalism. What were your initial thoughts once you saw that?
In terms of the Atlantic slave trade or the triangular slave trade, it became apparent to me that my colleagues wanted to downplay the significance of slavery
Mm-hmm.
and the human toll that was taken on individuals who were forced from their homeland to work free of charge, to suffer beatings, near starvation in some instances, inadequate clothing, working from sunup to sundown and beyond. That they wanted to whitewash history and pretend as if slavery didn't exist because they wanted to focus on the commodities that were transported as opposed to the humans that were transported during the time of the Atlantic slave trade or the triangular slave trade.
What would be the purpose of marginalizing slavery? Why would anybody marginalize a significant, probably one of the, I'll say, top 3 biggest pieces of America's backbone? Why would that even be an agenda? Why should that even be up for debate?
I think part of it is that my colleagues and their political persuasion think of America only in its positive terms, and that America is very exceptional, and that we are a Christian nation, and we only need to highlight the positives about our nations, that we need to get beyond what happened in the past and pretend as if it didn't exist.
Mm, okay. Was there any friction from free market to capitalism?
Uh, yes, the free, well, part of that has to do with the way that education code is written in regards to the social studies standards and curriculum, because for some reason, the legislators wanted an emphasis on free market or free enterprise system, which was supposed to be more positive than capitalism. For some reason, capitalism carried a negative connotation with the social conservatives. And so they acknowledged capitalism as a complement to the free market system, in the sense that they did allow the word to be used with the understanding that this was a term, capitalism was a term that was sometimes used to refer to the free market, free enterprise system.
Now, you mentioned they wanted to push their agenda that America is a Christian nation, and that's a debate I have with a lot of my colleagues also. What I read about the marginalizing, or I guess you can say marginalizing of Thomas Jefferson and his role, and the church and the state debate. How did that go? Or what were the changes that were made to the textbooks in regards to church and state?
My colleagues do not recognize the church-state separation issue. They are strict constitutionalists. And because the term is not mentioned in the body of the Constitution, they sort of disregard the amendment to the Constitution that talks about church-state separation. And they really did not want students to become acquainted with the legal terminology of church-state separation in terms of the challenges, the court challenges that have been raised regarding church-state separation issue. So from the standpoint, they decided to really develop the standard such that the student would draw the conclusion that there was no such thing as church-state separation in the Constitution, the way the standard was worded. I have a colleague that is always offering people $100 if they can tell him where in the Constitution the words church-state separation appear. Well, in the body of the Constitution, you won't see it, but it's in the amendments to the Constitution. So because I say they're strict constitutionalists and they really don't recognize church-state separation, that's why they worded the standard so the student would draw the conclusion that that terminology is not used in the Constitution.
I think that shows an apparent danger of strictly sticking to the Constitution, because I think there were obviously amendments for very good reasons. And even now, if you want to speak in modern day politics, it's a danger to stick strictly to the Constitution. I would touch on Ron Paul, but I think that's another day. Another big thing for me was McCarthy. For those who may not be familiar with Senator McCarthy, would you like to give us just a very brief background of McCarthy and the role he played in the 50s? And
Senator McCarthy was from Wisconsin, and during the post-war era of World War II, he came to believe that there were communist spies or other spies in the U.S. government, and that communism was gaining too much influence over institutions in America and the American way of life. So he was responsible for time in our history wherein people who were even suspected of being a spy or being associated with communists were challenged and were actually blacklisted from being able to hold jobs. Particularly was this so in the entertainment industry. Real Duplass never really had a chance to come into play during that era of McCarthyism, wherein the least amount of suspicion could land you in difficulties because you had been pointed out by McCarthy as an individual who either associated with spies or believed in communism, which in turn would lead you to do things to undermine the American way of life. And that went on for about 10 years.
So it was a witch hunt, to speak clearly. It was a witch hunt of suspected organizations, institutions, and individuals in all walks and areas of life who were thought to believe, by whatever clues he may or may not have, that they were socialists or communists or spies. And a lot of people were wrongfully convicted. A lot of people's lives were ruined. And due process just was totally ignored.
But let me also say, my colleagues used the Venona papers as a means for justifying McCarthyism, and students would walk away with the impression that he really did a great service to the country in terms of ferreting out spies and communist affiliates. But there are other academic individuals who challenge the veracity of the Venona papers, and they say that
rightly so.
McCarthy's actions were not justified. However, because my colleagues believe that the Venona papers vindicated McCarthyism, we have that in our social studies standards, and no critiquing of McCarthyism.
So I'm going to ask you personally, and I'm going to hope that the rumor is incorrect. Was he praised? Was his role lessened? Did he get a slap on the wrist? What was his treatment in the textbooks? How was he displayed in the textbooks?
Justification through the Venona papers for his actions.
I think that's pretty clear. I'm going to switch over to you speaking on the social conservatives. We had a lot of conservative groups, such as Heritage Foundation, the Moral Majority, the NRA, which is the National Rifle Association, even the Contract with America, and Phyllis Schlafly also was added in there. For the people who may not be familiar with these institutions, organizations, they're basically conservative-ran groups. NRAs highly believes in the Second Amendment. Contract with America, you have Gingrich trying to do his contract with America, his second contract with America. I don't know why he would do that. The Moral Majority, Heritage Foundation, and Phyllis Schlafly. Phyllis Schlafly was a constitutionalist lawyer, very strict constitutionalist lawyer, opposed the Equal Rights Amendment, and was an anti-feminist. So what's wrong with this picture? Why were all these organizations added, and how come a lot of the liberal or minority organizations were either ignored, deleted, or left out?
My colleagues, again, and I'm speaking in terms of the conservative voting bloc, felt that in 1998, when the social studies standards were revisited, that the liberals were in charge of that time, and that the social studies standards had a liberal flavor to them. So now it was time for the conservatives to put in standards that would balance out what the liberals had done in 1998. And that's why you have this listing of conservative organizations in the standards. We never had a discussion about what students needed to learn in social studies to be competitive not only within our state but outside the state and across the world as students migrate to other places when they complete their secondary education in Texas. And so you kind of have it's my time or my turn to put in the standards what I want that reflects my conservative point of view versus, again, what students need to learn. So that is why you have those conservative groups listed.
Do you think it was done
standards.
out of spite?
I can't say that it was done out of spite. I think it was done to tell their story about the conservative movement.
Is LULAC or Mount Def in there? Those are pretty big minority organizations.
They are minority organizations, and I don't recall a mention of those two
Really?
organizations. We had so much back and forth about who should and should not be included in the standards that I actually don't recall if they were included.
Well, that's really unfortunate. LULAC is ran by the Latino, I guess, community. If for anybody who may be a Texan native, they know the big influence that Hispanics have recently had in the past maybe 20 years. They now make up 38% of Dallas and over 50% of DISD. So for the Texas Board of Education to sort of marginalize these Hispanic groups. It's also Supreme Court Sotomayor. Was she in the curriculum? Was she added?
The comment about Sotomayor was the fact that she was just appointed to the Supreme Court, and her history was in the making. That she had not really done anything great to this point in time. So she didn't rise to the level of expectations, I guess, for my colleagues. I will say that they will tell you, and it is true, that there are more minority individuals mentioned in the standards in the 2010 version than in the 1998 version. However, we have two categories for listing of individuals included in such as.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in the included category, that means that you must be taught. If you are in the such as category, you're optional, or that gives the teacher an example of people that might be discussed when they are on a given topic with those names as a such as. The included stand the chance of being tested also when we do the statewide testing. So even though you have more minorities mentioned than in 1998,
they're in a such as category.
They're in the such as category. So I would say that's a continuation of the marginalization of the ethnic group.
For those who may not know, Sotomayor was recently appointed by President Obama. She is the first Hispanic Supreme Court judge, and she caught a lot of flack for some of her previous comments on the road to becoming a Supreme Court judge. Was it a bias on her for being an activist? Because I know Thurgood Marshall is a pretty fun topic to speak to people about Supreme Court judges. Why is there friction whenever we speak of activist Supreme Court judges? Sotomayor and Thurgood Marshall in particular.
Well, from the standpoint of the strict constitutionalist view that my colleagues have, activist judges would kind of be disregarded for their interpretations of the Constitution that would not fit in with the social conservative perspective. And also there's some individuals outside of your own ethnic group who never can recognize or give you credit for the struggles that you have overcome in terms of what you have accomplished. It was a struggle, I'm sure, for Sotomayor to be able to rise to the level to be appointed to the Supreme Court justice, because she was a minority and a minority in the law profession. So there is a segment of our society that never looks at the obstacles that you have to overcome in order to enter a profession, study for a career, and when you knock down all of those barriers that are deliberately placed in front of you, there's still no recognition of the fact that you have overcome and risen to the level that you have. And so I think that was part of the reaction of my colleagues to activist judges or lawyers when they talked about who should be included in the standards.
I agree. I think that's a much deeper conversation to have about race and profession, definitely. I'm going to switch it over to hip-hop for a second. Hip-hop was a struggle. I don't have it cleared up yet whether or not it was actually added in the curriculum, but I read that it was a huge struggle to add in the curriculum because of the content. while one may disagree with the content, they can't disagree or deny its influence in the international community. Why was it such a battle to add that as opposed to rock and roll or country, or I think even new beat was added in there too?
Hip hop definitely was not added.
Okay. Okay.
Do not think the new beat was added either.
Okay.
The issue regarding hip hop, and hip hop would have been included in terms of the impact of organizations, institutions on society.
Mm-hmm.
Hip hop has had a tremendous impact, but my colleagues only focus on one aspect of hip hop, and that was the very negative hip hop music, as if our teachers would not be savvy enough to either exclude that type of women hating, bashing, glorifying sex portion of hip hop, or if they included it, to have a serious discussion around words, the meanings of words, how words can hurt, how words can heal, or the structure of language and the way that you should express yourself, depending upon the circumstances in which you find yourself, so that it could be an educational moment around negative lyrics. They only focused on the negative lyrics. They did not look at gospel hip hop and other kinds of positive hip hop that is being produced. They did not look at the cottage industries that are and have developed around hip hop, the jewelry lines, the clothing lines, the fact that hip hop is studied in select colleges.
High level colleges at that.
High level colleges. But in fact, hip hop has been used actually in select public school system as a teaching tool in the language art. It was called vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
But they did not recognize any of those influences, not even the fact that cartoons and commercials use the hip hop language. None of that outweighed that small segment of the hip hop community that uses profanity and other kinds of things that you would not want young, impressionable children to hear. So that was why we had this big issue as to whether or not hip hop should or should not be included. It was a moral policing of the standards.
Okay, so the makeup of the board was, let me tell the people, the makeup of the board was, there was 15 members of the board, and there were 11 conservatives and 4 liberals. So, right, correct?
This last election cycle, we moved from 10 Republicans and 5 Democrats to 11 Republicans and 4 Democrats. The time that we were doing the social studies standards, we were 15, 10 and 5, 10 Republicans and 5 Democrats.
And how is the Board of Education appointed? How is there?
Actually, we run for office in our state Board of Education districts. There are 15 state Board of Education districts. And so you run on a partisan ticket. You either run as a Republican, a Democrat, or a Libertarian, or if there's another party out there, you run according to your party affiliation. And so you are elected by the people. We serve 4-year terms, but in the year that the census is taken and there is redrawing of all of the lines in the legislature as well as in the State Board of Education, we have to run for election again, all of us in 2012. And normally, because we serve staggered terms, you would draw for a 2- and 4-year term right after redistricting has occurred.
And I'm glad you said that. These people are elected by the people, so we, the people, have control, for the most part, on what goes inside of our textbooks. And since the curriculum is only changed every 10 years, whatever changes occur, affect a whole generation in states outside of Texas. So I think people need to think back and look how important local, regional, and state politics are, and how they are much, maybe as equal, as important as electing a federal official. Um, so, with the board makeup being highly unequal, um, what was your? I'm sure there was a lot of political bickering, a lot of political agendas in there. Um, I'm gonna I'm gonna blow it up to a bigger issue. You had Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell that said his number one. He was recently appointed. That said his number one goal as the minority leader is to make sure President Obama is a one-term president. I like to think the Board of Education as a sort of microcosm to what's going on, or what's been going on now. As you said, a lot of changes were made along party lines. What was your biggest headache when you went to sleep at night? What was the biggest change that you had a problem with?
My biggest problem was actually the social studies standards and the way we adopted them. There were a flurry of amendments at second reading and final adoption of the standards. And they came in so fast and furious, it was really difficult to tell whether or not what was being amended actually fit into the category that it was being proposed for. You never had an opportunity to look to see if there was still the same vertical and horizontal alignment of the standards after all of those last amendments were made, because there was no opportunity to go back and review the document as a whole, because this was second reading and final adoption, and we had to vote for that document. And of course, I voted against it because I was opposed to many of the changes that were made to the standards prior to the amendments. And I certainly was not going to vote for a document that I had not been able to read in its entirety after all of the amendments had been made.
Why weren't you able to read it in its entirety? Because of the pace it was passed or amended?
Because of the structure in terms of the timeline by which the standards have to be adopted.
Okay.
Once we get to second reading and final adoption, that is the time that we have to vote on whatever is up for second reading and final adoption. So you don't have a chance to go back and look over what was amended, because the decision has to be made that day so that the documents can get out to the public, and work can also be begun on the professional development that will have to go around the standards that were being implemented.
Okay. I'm going to make a few, maybe one or two final points. A lot of students and citizens of America sadly do not know their American history, whether it's a conservative point of view or a liberal point of view. A lot of people only remember or partly retain what they were taught in high school. What effects do you think that this textbook change will have in the upcoming generation? Because it sounds to me like a large part of our generation will be robbed of the stone cold truth, and
if students and organizations don't take it upon themselves to actually convey our history, then our students will not have a complete view of what happened to us in the past, what might happen to us in the future, because there's a tendency for things in the past to be repeated if you are not aware of what those issues are and the pitfalls of their issues and what you need to do to avoid repeating what has happened in the past. So students will be shortchanged on their history if they strictly rely upon the textbooks for their knowledge. they will also sometimes see their self-images impact. That's been one of the things that have been brought forth as people have studied the impact of impartial or incomplete knowledge about your history, that it can affect your self-esteem and your sense of self-worth. So it's very important for the true history of the struggles that we have had be told. And if we are not going to get it in the textbooks, then we have to find the means to get it outside of the school system.
Individual responsibility. I'm glad you touched on
individual responsibility as well as community responsibility.
Yes, definitely. It takes a village to raise a child.
Absolutely.
I'm glad you touched on self-image. Oddly, last night I was listening to, I admit I don't do this often, but I listened to Martin Luther King Jr. speech. I think it was given in 1967 to the NATRA, I think it is, where he's speaking about how black is beautiful, how the importance of our radio DJs and announcers. And he was, I was getting emotionally tore up, and he was speaking on how we need to change neighborhoods to brotherhoods. And,
absolutely.
And it's sad that that you can play that speech now, and we can still have the same conversation on changing neighborhoods into brotherhoods. He said we need to learn how to live amongst each other better. And I remember growing up reading texts by Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, a couple of those big ones. And even now I'm reading more about Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, and all the other figures. We're going to focus on minorities now. For minority children to not have not a figure to treat as God, but to know that, hey, maybe I can do this too. Because I know when I was listening to Martin Luther King, when I was younger, when I was reading Malcolm X speeches, I was like, maybe I too can graduate high school, get a PhD, blah, 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 become successful. And it was really inspiring to know that a lot of black people invented a lot of, I think a black man invented the pace machine. I found out yesterday. So I think it's really, and so when you talk about Hispanics also, I think it's very encouraging and inspiring to know that a Hispanic lady in this day of age, in 2000, I think she was appointed in 2009, in this day of age, we finally had a Hispanic Supreme Court judge. I think taking that part out of history or marginalizing, I think it kills, like you said, or it doesn't allow kids to develop a fully self-image. And I think what we need to do as a community is to find another outlet to teach our children maybe a more focused part of history on the importance of Spanish and Latino people in our history, how they fought alongside the whites and the blacks in many of our wars. We can speak about Commander Vallejos, who turned the California district to California state. And I also read he was either left out or just... Anyways, I think what can we as a community do to teach our children the minority side of history, African American history, Latino history? What can we do?
We need to make certain that our children...
And this importance of that.
We need to make certain that our children attend museums that reflect our history, like the African American Museum over in Fair Park. There's the Cowboy Hall of Fame Museum over in Fort Worth with regards to African Americans who were cowboys. So the churches, sororities, fraternities, and other local community organizations like neighborhood associations. Our children are out of school for summer. So we need to hold summer camps that will teach our history to our children, because we have a proud heritage, and our children need to know our heritage. They need to know that there were role models and inspirational individuals in our past. just as they need to see living, breathing role models in the present that can encourage them to aspire and to achieve and to be productive members of society. So if the school system is not going to teach the whole of history, then we ourselves need to teach our history. But we also need to be present when curriculum is being developed and voice our point of view and even develop our own standards that could be incorporated into the existing standards so that students will have a fuller view of history than what is being currently presented as minorities and their contributions are marginalized in the text. It's very important that we know our history and project ourselves into the present and into the future based upon what we know about our history.
And I'm going to leave on this final point. Speaking of all this action that the community has to take, that proves that we cannot rely on any institution or any government to fully provide the whole truth. Since we have to go on this large of a campaign effort, I love the idea of the summer camps especially. Since we have to go on this big of a leap, final question here: was it a successful whitewashing of the history textbooks?
From my perspective, yes, there was a successful whitewashing of our history in the textbooks. I particularly agitated over the fact that there is reference in the standards to the fact that it was the majority who gave the minority their civil rights without any acknowledgement of the agitation, the marches, the speeches that individuals had, the jailings that individuals who were on the front lines of the civil rights movement had to endure in order to get the attention of the majority so that the minority could be given their civil rights. And in fact, who else could give us our rights since we were not in control of the institutions that made decisions about us? And it was considered to be radical Republicans who gave us our rights as opposed to, the mainstream Republicans. So
definitely not these rounds of Republicans that would do that.
Definitely not these rounds of Republicans that would do that. And all the more reason why we as a minority community need to triple and quadruple our efforts to get out and actually vote at election time, because decisions are being made about you and for you, and at least if you vote, you have a small representation of what your values are if you vote for a person who has like values of yours. So we need to vote. Too much blood, sweat, and tears was lost in order to get us that right to vote. So we need to exercise it.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure sitting down with you. Thank you for the time. Thank you for the effort and the time and sweat that you put into the Dallas community and the Texas state. And if I had a hat, you're very sure I would be tipping it to you. Thank you very much, Ms. Knight.
Thank you. I've enjoyed discussing with you.